Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Learn from the Masters. Today I have a game from Harry Nelson Pillsbury playing the white pieces and Georg Marco playing the black pieces from Nuernberg in 1896. So I'm going to be explaining some ideas, concepts, showing some tactics, going over a few variations, and hopefully we can learn some things and improve as chess players together. So the first move, d4. Two main replies here for black. The blue arrows on the black side and the orange arrows on the white side show the main opening ideas according to opening theory. So two main ideas here, knight f6 and d5 are the main moves. d5. White chooses to play c4, which is the queen's gambit, gambiting the c-pawn. Black decides to decline the gambit with e6, just supporting the d5 pawn. White plays knight to c3, developing his knight before his bishop. Black has many replies here. c6, just solidifying again in the center. White decides to develop his kingside knight, knight to f3. And black plays a little bit of an unconventional move here, bishop to d6. So you'll see the two blue arrows here showing the two main moves, d takes c4, or knight to f6. And one of the reasons why knight to f6 is one of the main moves is because this knight here, once it moves to f6, controls the e4 square twice, and the move bishop to d6 does not do that, which allows white to immediately play d4 and challenge black in the center. So after e4, black has to do something with this e4 advance. Probably cannot allow white to play e5. White would have too much central control, and black's developed his bishop to d6 and would just have to move it immediately after anyways. So d takes e4, knight takes e4. White has some developed knights here, and black has this bishop on d6. Black decides to play bishop to e7, doesn't want to allow white to capture this bishop on d6. So bishop to e7, but now we see black is a little bit behind in development. Black's developed his bishop to d6, and then only to return it to the e7 square, so he's already moved it twice. White continues to develop his pieces with bishop to d3, preparing to castle kingside. Black now develops his kingside knight, knight f6. And white castles, gets his king to safety. And black does the same thing as well, castles kingside. Now we see the move knight to f6, check, bishop to f6. So now black is actually threatening this pawn on d4. Bishop takes d4. And the bishop is supported by the queen. So black would win a pawn after white recaptures knight takes d4. But can't do that right away because of a tactic. So if we can imagine the line, bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, white had to have this nice move, bishop to h7 check, winning the queen. So even though this might be a threat at some point, immediately it's not able to happen right away. But white has this idea of defending the pawn anyways, with bishop to c2, and this move sets up white's next move. So black develops his queenside knight, knight to d7, and we see white's idea here was queen to d3. So now white has this nice battery on the b1 h7 diagonal. White is actually threatening checkmate, queen takes h7. So black must defend that. g6 stops the immediate threat of checkmate, and white continues to develop his pieces. Bishop to h6. So now this rook here on h6 is attacked. White is developing his pieces and attacking black's at the same time, so gaining time, gaining a lead in development. Rook to e8, moving the rook out of the attack from the bishop. Rook f to e1, just putting the rook on the half-open file. And b6. Black is trying to develop this queen's bishop to the b7 square. Queen to e4. Now queen to e4 attacks this pawn on c6, and also sets up the idea that white had in mind for his next move. Bishop to b7, protecting this pawn on c6, and then we'll see white's idea here was to play h4. Just thinking about playing h5 in the future, and just sort of thinking of ways to bust open the king side here. If white is successfully able to open up the g file, white can eventually move his queen here and start an attack against the black king. So e5. Black now wants to take advantage of the fact that his rook here is lined up with white's queen, so has the idea of taking on d4 and then opening up an attack on the white queen. So white has to do something about that. D takes e5, and we see the move knight takes e5. Now the position is getting quite complicated. Both sides are trying to develop their pieces as quickly as possible and control the center and find good squares for their pieces. So white decides to play an interesting move here, perhaps not the best, but white decides to play rook e to d1, which attacks the black queen. However, white could have tried this interesting idea of knight to g5, not allowing black to play this knight takes f3 idea with check, trading off pieces, and then black could probably equalize. So after knight to g5, black could try queen to e7, maintaining pressure on this knight, also protecting the bishop on b7, also getting out of the way of this d-file, preparing to bring his other rook over to d8. So after queen to e7, perhaps queen to f4. Now white has this idea of lining up his rook with the black queen. After queen to f4, c5, giving this bishop some more scope along this diagonal. And the position is roughly equal. Both sides really don't have an advantage at this point, and both sides are still fighting for control over the center and open lines and diagonals. So white had this interesting idea of knight to g5, but decided to play something different instead. Rook e to d1, like I said, attacking the black queen. And this is a very critical position in the game. Objectively, black's best choice here is to play queen to c7. Just moving out of the attack of the rook, preparing to bring his other rook to the d-file, supporting this bishop on b7 with the idea of playing c5 and attacking this queen on e4, also supporting this knight. And after, say, something like knight to h2, white still doesn't want to allow black to play this knight takes f3 idea, exchanging off pieces. So he would play knight to h2, perhaps with the idea of bringing it to g4 at some point. So after knight to h2, we would see c5 attacking the black or the white queen here. After queen to f4, now white is attacking this bishop on f6. And we would see perhaps maybe the best move would be queen to c6. Now black has this nice battery on the a8 h1 diagonal, and black is actually now threatening checkmate. Queen takes g2. So white would have to do something about that to prevent that. And f3 looks like a decent move to play, but now that would create weaknesses around the white king here. In the long run, these squares would end up being weak around the white king. And this knight on h2 now looks like it's slightly out of play. So after f3, bishop to h8, just moving this bishop back to a safe square. And black is definitely doing better here than white. The white pieces seem to be a little bit uncoordinated, although it's still roughly objectively equal, but black is definitely probably better. So in this critical position of the game, black had this nice idea of playing queen to c7, just sidestepping the attack and still controlling the center, and then producing a counterattack. But black decides to ignore the threat of on his queen and play this in-between move, knight takes f3, which ends up being a mistake. Now we see both rooks are staring at the queen. This rook is staring at this queen, and then this rook is staring at this queen. White is in check, so white would simply recapture with queen takes f3. And now the black queen is under attack. The white queen is safe, and the white queen is also adding pressure to this bishop on f6, which ends up being a problem piece. So after queen takes f3, objectively the best move here is to block the attack on the queen with bishop to d4. Now this moves the bishop to d4, it pins the bishop to the queen, but it also protects the bishop. And after the move bishop to e3, now we have this bishop here which is pinned. We're going to attack the pinned piece. Objectively, black could play this queen to e7, getting out of the pin, protecting his bishop on b7 and preparing a counterattack of his own. So white has two ways to recapture the bishop here on d4 with the rook and the bishop. Capturing with the bishop is not as good because after bishop takes d4, c5. Now this bishop is attacked, and the queen is attacked. White cannot defend both at the same time, and would probably have to play something like queen to f6. Now white has got this battery on the a1 h8 diagonal and is threatening checkmate. But after black simply captures the bishop, c takes d4, queen takes e7, rook takes e7, and rook takes d4. Now a lot of pieces have gotten traded off and white is still up a pawn, but white definitely had better than to capture with the bishop, and could have actually captured with the rook. Rook takes d4. And the reason why this is better, because after black plays c5, we still have this attack on the queen and the rook, but white has this nice move of rook d5, blocking the attack and protecting the rook. Now, if black recaptures the rook, white could simply recapture with the pawn or the queen, and is at least traded a rook for a bishop, and would still be up material. More so than just being up a pawn. So after rook to d5, queen takes h4, wins the pawn. Rook a to d1, just supporting the rook on d5. Bishop to c6, just preventing white from being able to play bishop to a4. Bishop to d3, just protecting this pawn on c4. And white is doing quite well in this position. So objectively, black should have tried to block the attack on his queen with the bishop and move the bishop out of harm's way. But black tries to play this move queen to e7, which moves the queen out of the immediate attack, protects the bishop on b7 and the bishop on f6. But the queen ends up being overloaded in this position because white finds a brilliant resource here. White finds this move, rook to d7. Now, the bishop is attacked by the rook, and the queen is attacked by the rook. And not to mention that this queen here still got pressure on this f6 bishop, so the immediate queen takes d7 is a blunder and leads to checkmate, because now this queen can capture on f6. And now white has this threat of checkmate on g7. Queen to d4 is the only move which stops checkmate right away, but black has to basically give up his entire army and still ends up getting checkmated anyways. So we see that queen takes d7 is not an option, and one other option, which is what was played, is queen to e5, maintaining the defense of this problem bishop on f6, and we see why this bishop ends up becoming a problem. The queen basically has to stay and defend this bishop on f6, which is basically tying the entire black army together with the only defense. So after queen to e5, the bishop on b7 was undefended, so rook takes b7. Queen takes b2, now black is trying to counterattack himself. The rook on a1 is attacked, so rook a to d1. And now black can't even capture on c2, because again it's still just needing to stay on this diagonal and protect the bishop on f6. So after rook to d1, we see that black could try this rook a to b8, attacking the rook on b7, but after simply playing rook takes a7, rook to e7, rook to a to d7, rook takes d7, rook takes d7, and we see that the black position is still not good. This bishop here on c2 still can't be taken by the queen. This queen is still threatening to take on f6 should this queen ever get off this diagonal. This pawn on c6 is weak. This rook is well placed to come over to f7 should this bishop ever move. This queen's on the f7 square. So even rook a to b8, which is an option, definitely doesn't improve things very much. Black tried rook to e6, trying to defend this bishop, allowing the queen to take on c2. But after the simple move, Bishop to b3, defending the bishop. Black actually resigned in this position because there's no way black can actually improve his position. We see that the dark squares around the king are still weak for black. There's no way for black to really improve his position. His rook on a8 is stuck defending this pawn on a7. And basically white can continue to develop his pieces. He can bring his rook from d1 to d7, double attack the rook on a7, attack this pawn on f7. There's no way that black can survive this. White can think about ideas about moving the pawn to c5, attacking this rook. Now the rook would have to move. So basically black resigned in this position. So if we go back to the critical moment of the game, black's best try obviously was to move out of the way of the attack. Queen to c7. So in critical moments of the game, it's always important to pay attention to which side can create threats quicker. Here, white can create the threats more quickly, which is why his position was able to gain the upper hand. This bishop on f6 ends up being the big problem piece in the position. But black did have a chance to gain an advantage by simply moving out of the attack and creating a counterattack of his own. So some other key things to take away from this game are, in the opening, try not to move your pieces too often, unless it's absolutely necessary. Also, creating weaknesses around your king. We see that the black king has already got some weaknesses around this position. And this bishop on f6 ends up becoming a big problem piece because it only ends up being defended by the queen. The queen usually doesn't like to play defense. The queen is usually better playing offense. So hopefully you were able to learn something, and stay tuned for the next episode.